The light comes soft that morning, breaking pale across the backyard, where the lavender still holds dew along its stems. Evelyn moves slowly between the rows, her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, steam rising into air that smells like soil and something blooming she can't name. She stops near the raised bed where the herbs grow wild and uneven. And that's when she sees it. A folded piece of paper tucked beneath a terracotta pot, edges darkened with moisture. She sets the mug down on the wooden bench, and picks up the note with both hands, careful, like it might dissolve. The handwriting is neat, unfamiliar. It tells her to trim the rosemary back before the heat sets in, that it'll come back stronger if she's not afraid to cut it down first. She reads it twice. Her chest tightens in a way she hasn't felt in months, not sharp, but present, like someone just walked into the room she thought was empty. I guess I should start by saying I didn't used to be someone who needed a garden. I mean, I liked flowers fine, the way anyone does. But I never thought of dirt as something that could save you. That was his thing, my husband. He'd come home with his hands stained green and smelling like cut grass. And he'd sit at the table and talk about root systems like they mattered more than the news. I used to tease him about it. I'd say, "You know we can just buy tomatoes at the store, right?" And he'd smile and say, "Yeah, but these ones know us." After he died, I didn't go out there for a while. Weeks, maybe longer. I don't really remember. Time got strange. The house felt too big and too small at the same time. And I couldn't figure out which rooms to be in. My daughter called every other day and asked if I was eating real food, and I'd lie and say yes. My son sent me articles about grief that I never opened. Everyone meant well. Everyone wanted me to be okay faster than I could manage. One morning I woke up early, before the sun really hit the windows. And I walked outside in my bathrobe and stood in the middle of the garden. It looked like something forgotten. Weeds had started creeping in between the stones. The tomatoes were sprawling and tangled. The lavender was leggy and thin. I felt ashamed, honestly. Like I'd let him down. Like this place that used to be ours was now just mine. And I didn't know how to hold it alone. I started trying. I pulled some weeds. I watered what looked thirsty. I didn't know what I was doing. But I did it anyway because it felt like the only way to stay connected to him, you know? Like if I kept this alive, then part of us was still alive too. That's when the first note showed up. I almost didn't see it. I was kneeling by the herb bed, trying to remember if he used to cut the basil from the top or the side. And I noticed the corner of something white sticking out from under one of the pots. I pulled it free and unfolded it. The handwriting was small and careful. It said, "Trim the rosemary now, before the real heat comes. Don't be afraid to cut it back hard. It wants to grow, it just needs permission." I sat back on my heels and read it again. My hands were shaking a little. I looked around the yard like someone might still be there. But it was just me and the birds and the fence line. I didn't recognize the handwriting. It wasn't his. But the words, the way they were written, they sounded like something he would have said. That same gentleness. That same certainty that plants were tougher than they looked. I folded the note back up and put it in my pocket. I didn't tell anyone about it. I'm not even sure why. Maybe because it felt private. Maybe because I was afraid if I said it out loud, it would stop being real. I did what the note said. I trimmed the rosemary back, more than I thought I should, until it looked almost bare. And I waited. A week later, there was another note. This one was tucked into the trellis where the clematis used to climb. It told me to deadhead the flowers that were spent, to give the plant energy to keep blooming instead of making seeds. It told me the garden wasn't giving up on me, so I shouldn't give up on it either. I cried when I read that one. I sat right there on the ground and cried. Like I hadn't let myself cry in months. Because it wasn't just about the flowers. It was about me. It was someone seeing me still trying and saying, keep going. I started checking for notes every morning. I'd walk out with my coffee and scan the beds, the benches, the pots. Some days there'd be one, some days there wouldn't. But when they were there, they felt like company. They felt like I wasn't doing this alone. The notes knew things. They knew which plants needed more water. Which ones were root-bound, when to move something into shade. They knew the garden the way he used to know it. And that scared me a little, honestly. Because whoever was leaving them had to be coming into my yard without me knowing. Had to be watching, at least a little. And I didn't know if I should feel grateful or violated. But I kept reading them. I kept following the advice. And the garden started to come back. The rosemary filled in, dense and fragrant. The tomatoes straightened out once I staked them properly. The lavender thickened at the base. It started to look like the place we'd built together. And that made me feel something I couldn't name. Relief, maybe. Or permission to still be here. I thought about my husband a lot during those weeks. I remembered the summer we'd first planted everything, how he'd insisted we do it right. With compost and mulch and stakes driven deep. I remember he got sunburned on his shoulders and I rubbed aloe on him that night. While he talked about how the garden was going to outlast us both. If we took care of it. I told him that was morbid. He laughed and said, no, it's hopeful. I didn't understand what he meant then. I think I do now. My daughter came to visit one afternoon. She walked around the garden with me and said it looked good. Said she was glad I was getting outside. She asked if I was doing this all by myself. And I said yes, because technically I was. The notes weren't doing the work. They were just showing me how. She hugged me before she left and said, Dad would be proud of you. I nodded. But what I didn't say was that I didn't feel proud. I felt like I was being carried by something I didn't understand. And I wasn't sure if that was okay or if it made me weak. That night, I stayed up late and stared at the pile of notes I'd been keeping in a drawer. I'd saved every single one. I read through them slowly, looking for clues. The handwriting was consistent. The tone was warm but not overly familiar. There were no names, no dates, no explanations. Just instructions. Just kindness. I realized I was starting to depend on them. I was starting to wait for them. And that scared me more than anything. Because it meant I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was hoping. And hope felt dangerous. By the time summer deepened, the garden was unrecognizable from what it had been in the spring. Everything was lush and green and alive in a way that felt almost aggressive. Like it was daring me to give up on it. I didn't. I kept showing up. I kept doing what the notes told me to do. And the garden kept responding. But I also kept wondering. Who was leaving these notes? And why? I started paying closer attention to the neighborhood. I watched for unfamiliar cars, for people lingering too long at the corner. I checked the gate latch to see if it had been touched. I even considered setting up a camera. But that felt paranoid, and I didn't want to be that person. The notes kept coming, though. Each one felt more personal than the last. One told me the mint was trying to take over. And I should give it its own space before it choked everything else out. Another said the tomatoes were getting leggy because they were reaching for something. And maybe I should talk to them while I worked. That one made me laugh, but I also felt seen in a way that made my chest hurt. I started talking to the plants. Just a little. Just while I watered or pulled weeds. I'd say things like, okay, let's see if we can get you standing up straight, or come on. Now, don't give up on me. It felt ridiculous at first. But then it started to feel normal. And then it started to feel necessary. My son called one evening and asked how I was doing. I told him the garden was doing well. He said that wasn't what he asked. I didn't know how to explain that the garden and I were the same thing now, that If it was okay, then maybe I was okay too. So I just said I was fine, and we talked about his work for a while. And then he had to go. After we hung up, I sat on the back porch and watched the light change. The sky went from blue to pink to deep purple. And the fireflies started blinking in the spaces between the plants. I thought about how my husband used to sit out here with me on summer nights. How we'd let the mosquitoes bite us. Rather than go inside, how he'd reach over and hold my hand without saying anything. I missed that. I missed him. But the missing had changed shape. It wasn't the sharp, breathless thing it used to be. It was quieter now. It was woven into everything, but it didn't knock me down anymore. The next morning, there was another note. This one was different. It wasn't about the garden. It said, "You're doing better than you think. He would want you to know that." I read it 3 times. I felt my throat get tight and my eyes start to burn. I looked around the yard, really looked, like maybe I'd see someone watching from the bushes or over the fence. But there was nothing. Just the garden, green and wild and alive. I realized then that I had to know. I couldn't keep living with this invisible presence, this ghost. Made of paper and kindness. I had to see who was doing this, even if it broke the spell. Even if it made everything harder. I decided to wait. That evening, I set my alarm for before sunrise. I made coffee in the dark and sat by the kitchen window. With all the lights off, watching the backyard slowly emerge from the shadows. I felt foolish. I felt desperate. I felt awake in a way I hadn't been in months. Nothing happened for a long time. The sky got lighter. The birds started up. I saw a rabbit hop across the lawn and disappear under the fence. And then I saw him. A man, youngish, maybe in his 30s. Coming through the gate with something in his hand. He moved carefully, quietly, like he didn't want to disturb anything. He knelt by the herb bed and tucked a piece of paper under the same pot. Where I always found them. Then he stood and looked at the garden for a minute. Just looking, his hands in his pockets. I didn't think. I just opened the back door and stepped out. He froze when he saw me. His face went pale. He looked like he wanted to run, but he didn't. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I didn't mean to scare you." I walked toward him slowly, my coffee mug still in my hand. "Who are you?" He hesitated. "My name's Colin. I used to help your husband sometimes. With the garden." I stared at him. The name didn't register at first, and then it did. Vaguely. My husband had mentioned someone once or twice, a younger guy from the hardware store. Who didn't mind getting dirty, who had good instincts with plants. "You've been leaving the notes." "Yeah." He looked down at his boots. "I know it's weird. I'm sorry." "Why?" He looked back up at me. And I could see he was trying to decide how much to say. "Your husband made me promise. Before he died, he asked me to check on the garden, to make sure it didn't fall apart. He said you'd try to take care of it. But you wouldn't know how, and you'd blame yourself if it died. He didn't want that." I felt something crack open inside me. "He asked you to do this?" "Yeah. He was really worried about you. He talked about you a lot, actually. About how much you meant to him. About how strong you were, but also how hard you were on yourself. He said if the garden died, you'd think it meant you weren't enough. And he wanted me to make sure that didn't happen." I had to turn away because I couldn't look at him anymore. I stared at the rosemary, thick and green and alive. And I thought about how close I'd come to letting it all go. How close I'd come to giving up. "I thought about telling you," Colin said quietly. "But I didn't know how. And then I thought maybe if I just left the notes. You could keep going without having to explain anything to anyone. I thought that might be easier." "It was," I said, my voice barely steady. "But it also made me feel crazy. I'm sorry." I turned back to him. "Don't be. You kept your promise. That matters." We stood there in the early light. Two strangers connected by someone who wasn't there anymore. The garden buzzed quietly around us, bees already working the lavender, a breeze moving through the tomato leaves. Did he really talk about me that much? I asked. Colin smiled, just a little. All the time. He said you were the only person who ever made him feel like he didn't have to be anyone but himself. He said being with you was like coming home. I couldn't hold it together after that. I cried right there in front of this man I didn't know. And he didn't try to fix it or make it stop. He just stood there and waited, and somehow that was exactly right. When I finally pulled myself together, I asked him if he wanted some coffee. He said he didn't want to intrude. I said he already had, so he might as well stay. We sat on the porch and talked. He told me about working with my husband, about how patient he'd been. How he'd taught Colin to see what plants needed just by looking at them. I told him stories too, about how my husband used to bring me flowers from the garden and put them in jars all over the house. How he'd hum while he worked and didn't even realize he was doing it. It felt good to talk about him with someone who'd known him, even just a little. It felt like he was still real, still part of the world. Not just a memory I was carrying alone. Before Colin left, I asked him if he'd keep coming by. Not to leave notes, but just to help when I got stuck. He said he would, if I wanted. I said I did. After he was gone, I went back into the garden and picked up the note. He'd left that morning. It said, "The basil is ready to harvest. Use it before it flowers, or it'll get bitter. Save some seeds for next year." I folded it carefully and added it to the others in the drawer. Then I went outside and started cutting basil. The garden became something different after that. It wasn't just mine anymore. But it also wasn't shared the way it used to be with my husband. It was something in between. Colin came by once a week, sometimes twice if something needed urgent attention. We worked together in a rhythm that felt easy, natural. He'd show me things, and I'd remember things. And between the two of us the garden stayed alive. I learned that Colin had lost his own father when he was young. He didn't say much about it, but I understood. He knew what it felt like to have someone gone. He knew what it meant to hold on to something they'd loved. We didn't talk much while we worked. Mostly we just moved through the beds, pulling weeds, checking for pests, watering what needed it. But the silence wasn't empty. It was full of presence, of care, of two people tending something bigger than themselves. My daughter came to visit again, and this time Colin was there. She looked surprised, maybe a little suspicious. And I could see her trying to figure out what this was. I introduced him and explained, and I watched her face soften as she understood. Before she left, she pulled me aside and said, "I'm glad you have help, Mom. I'm glad you're not doing this alone." I told her I was glad too. The garden taught me things that summer. It taught me that cutting something back isn't the same as giving up. It taught me that things can look dead and still be alive underneath. It taught me that growth isn't always visible. That sometimes the most important work happens where you can't see it, in the roots, in the dark. I started sleeping better. I started eating real meals again. I started calling my son back instead of just texting. I started to feel like a person again, not just a shadow moving through a house. One afternoon Colin and I were sitting on the porch after working, drinking water and watching the light shift. He said, "You know, your husband told me something once. He said the garden wasn't really about the plants. It was about having a reason to be still, to pay attention, to let things take the time they needed." I looked at him. When did he say that? The last time I saw him. He knew he was running out of time, I think. He said he wanted to make sure someone would keep showing you that it was okay to be still, that you didn't have to rush through the grief, that the garden would wait for you. I felt tears on my face before I even realized I was crying. Not the hard, breathless kind. The quiet kind. The kind that just comes because something true has been said out loud. "Thank you," I said, "for keeping that promise, for helping me remember how to do this." Colin nodded. "He made it easy. He loved you a lot." "I know," I said. "I really know." As summer turned toward fall, the garden started to shift. The tomatoes slowed down. The basil began to flower despite my best efforts. The light changed, coming in lower and cooler, making everything look softer. I started thinking about what I wanted to plant in the spring. I started thinking about changes I wanted to make, things I wanted to try. Not because my husband would have wanted them, but because I did. And that felt like something. That felt like healing. One evening I sat down and wrote a note of my own. I didn't leave it for Colin. I left it for myself, tucked under the same pot where I'd found the first one. It said, "You're doing fine. The garden knows. Keep going." I stood there in the fading light and looked at everything we'd kept alive. The rosemary, thick and green. The lavender, fragrant and buzzing. The tomatoes, still producing even as the days got shorter. It wasn't perfect. There were weeds I'd missed, plants that hadn't made it, places where things hadn't grown the way I'd hoped. But it was alive. It was loved. And that was enough. I thought about my husband and what he'd said about the garden outlasting us. I thought about Colin and his quiet loyalty. I thought about my children, living their own lives, carrying forward in their own ways. I thought about how love doesn't stop when someone dies. It just finds new shapes, new hands, new ways of moving through the world. That night I dreamed about the garden. In the dream, my husband was there, kneeling by the herb bed, his hands in the soil. I walked over to him and he looked up and smiled. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I understood. The garden was his way of staying. The garden was his way of saying, "I'm still here. I'm still with you, keep going." When I woke up, the sun was just starting to come through the window. I got up and made coffee and walked outside in my bathrobe. The air was cool and damp and smelled like earth. I stood in the middle of the garden and felt the weight of it, the life of it. The presence of everything that had been loved into existence here. I was still here. The garden was still here. And that was more than enough. Now when I go out to the garden in the mornings, I don't look for notes anymore. I look at the plants. I check the soil with my fingers. I notice which leaves are yellowing, which stems need support, what's ready to be harvested. I've started to trust my own hands again. I've started to believe that I know what I'm doing. Or at least that I can figure it out. Colin still comes by, but not as often. Once every couple of weeks, sometimes less. We've settled into a rhythm where I handle most of it. And he helps when I get stuck or when something needs two pairs of hands. It feels balanced. It feels right. I've started making changes to the garden. Small ones at first. I planted sunflowers along the back fence. Because I wanted something tall and cheerful. I moved the mint into its own container. After it tried to take over half the herb bed, I let wildflowers seed themselves in the corners. And now those spaces are full of color and bees and small beautiful chaos. My husband would probably laugh at some of the choices I've made. He was more methodical, more planned. But I think he'd also be glad that I'm making it my own. That I'm not just preserving something frozen in time, but letting it grow and change the way living things are supposed to. My son visited last month. He walked through the garden with me and said it looked incredible. He asked how I'd learned so much, and I told him the truth. I told him about Colin, about the notes, about the promise his father had made. My son got quiet for a long time. And then he said, "That sounds exactly like Dad. Always thinking ahead, always trying to take care of you." "He did," I said. "He really did." We stood there together in the late afternoon light. And my son put his arm around me. And I leaned into him the way I used to when he was small and needed comfort. Except now I was the one being comforted, and that was okay. That was part of how things change. I think about my husband every single day. Not in the sharp, painful way I used to. More like a constant presence, a warmth I carry with me. He's in the smell of rosemary when I brush past it. He's in the taste of tomatoes still warm from the sun. He's in the feeling of dirt under my nails and the ache in my back. After a few hours of weeding, he's not gone. He's just different. He's part of the garden. Now, part of the soil, part of everything that grows here. I've started writing notes to myself sometimes. Little reminders, little truths I'm learning as I go. Things like, don't be afraid to cut things back. They'll grow stronger. Or, some things won't make it, and that's not your fault. I fold them up and keep them in the drawer with the ones Colin left. They sit together like a conversation between past and present. Between grief and hope. I know I won't tend this garden forever. Someday I'll be too old, or too tired, or I'll be gone too. And that's okay. Because I think the point was never to keep everything exactly the same. The point was to love it while I could. To pay attention. To let it teach me what it needed to teach me. I hope when I'm gone, someone else finds this place and decides to care for it. Maybe they'll change everything. Maybe they'll plant vegetables where I planted flowers. Maybe they'll rip out the paths and start over. That's fine. As long as they understand that this soil has been loved. That it holds something more than just nutrients and roots. It holds intention. It holds memory. It holds the shape of two people who built something together. And the shape of the person who learned to carry it forward alone. Last week a bird built a nest in the clematis vine. I found it by accident while I was checking for new growth. The nest is messy and small and perfect. Woven from grass and string and bits of things I don't recognize. I've been watching the mother bird come and go. Bringing food, tending her young, doing what her body tells her to do. I thought about how that's all any of us are doing, really. Tending what we're given. Building something that will outlast us, even if it's just by a little. Trusting that the work matters even when we can't see the outcome. This morning I walked outside with my coffee and stood barefoot in the grass. The dew was cold and the air smelled like late summer turning toward fall. The rosemary is thick and dark green. The tomatoes are heavy and red. The lavender is starting to fade, but it's still beautiful. In the way old things are beautiful when they've lived fully. Everything is exactly as it should be. I'm still here. The garden is still here. And I'm learning, slowly, that being here is enough. That showing up is enough. That letting yourself be loved, even by something as simple as dirt. And plants and morning light, is enough. I set my coffee down on the bench and knelt by the herb bed. The soil was warm under my hands. I pulled a few weeds, checked the moisture, tucked a stem back into place. I worked slowly, without hurry, letting my hands remember what they'd learned. Somewhere nearby a bird sang. The sun climbed higher. The day opened up around me, full of small tasks and quiet presence. I stood up, brushed the dirt from my knees, and picked up my coffee. I looked at the garden one more time, at everything. We'd built and lost and built again. And then I went inside to start the rest of my day.